just a short introduction. So Paul Gorski, founder of the Equity Literacy Institute and EdChange. Been working on this topic for 20 years on topics of equity, written over 70 articles, and I don't know how many books on this topic. And is really a person, I would say, globally famous for his fight for equity for students across the world, I would say. So Paul, thank you so much for joining us, and I give you the floor.
Okay, well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'm going to share my screen. So I was asked to present on social policies that support schools to better address socioeconomic disadvantages. I do want to say before I begin that my experience doing this work in many different places is that the big problem to me is not a practical problem. At least the initial problem is not a practical problem in terms of selecting the correct policy. Instead, I think the initial problem is ideological. It's a failure to understand why disparities, educational disparities exist between socioeconomic groups, so that the policies that are chosen generally are policies that cannot work because they're either based on misunderstanding or just based on stereotypes and bias. So what I want to do is talk about that relationship between starting with, well, what is the perspective that we need to develop policies, the right policies, and then how do those perspectives help us create the policies that we need or support the policies that we need. In order to do that, I need to talk about what's called deficit ideology, which I will get to in a second. But so I want to talk about the dangers of deficit ideology and ideas that are becoming very popular in education, ideas like grit or resilience, and how those belief systems end up misinforming policy so that we end up with bad policy. So this, to me, when we're talking about this topic, this is really our key question. The first question we might ask is, why are poor people poor? I don't like the term poor people. So another way of asking that is, why are people who are experiencing poverty? What explains the existence of poverty? In a way, we might say, just looking at different levels of inequity and oppression, that the reality is probably that as long as poverty exists, there is going to be some level of educational outcome disparities. You know, as long as some people don't have enough to eat, as long as some people don't have access to high quality healthcare, as long as some families don't have access to stable housing, that is going to affect families and their children in schools. But if we want to take this question and put it into schools, we might ask, and in virtually every place that I've done equity work, the reality is students who are experiencing poverty do not do as well in school as their wealthier peers, their wealthier classmates. So the question is why? I mean, we all know that this is a fact. On average, students who are experiencing poverty do not do as well in school as students who are economically privileged. So we all know that that is a fact. In order to create policy to address this, what we have to do is not just know it's a fact, we have to understand why. What is it that explains this disparity? And if I don't answer this question correctly, then there is no chance that I can create social policy or educational policy that solves the problem. And in many education systems, this is the cycle that we're always in, that, misunderstanding the problem. And because we misunderstand the problem, developing solutions that cannot solve the problem. So our first task is to learn how to understand the problem. And that's where we're going to start. This is my grandmother on my mother's side. My grandmother grew up in an area of the United States that's called Appalachia. It's a very high poverty, poor area. And you can see here that they could not afford clothes. So they made their own clothes. You can see she grew up in kind of a shabby, half broken down house. And as I was growing up, I always heard stereotypes about people like my grandmother. I always heard that people who are experiencing poverty do not value education. But my grandmother was at the top of her high school's graduating class, so I knew she valued education. Or people would say, another stereotype I learned was that people who are experiencing poverty are violent, or that they're bad communicators. But when I spent time in my grandmother's community, which was full of people experiencing poverty, that did not seem to be true of them. And so I think the first step is that we have to challenge the common stereotypes about people experiencing poverty. Because if we are creating policy through bad stereotypes, then we are going to create bad policies. And again, this happens in education all the time. We create equity approaches that simply create more inequity by hiding the inequity behind misunderstandings that blame marginalized communities for the disparities they are experiencing. So that's what I want to talk about related to poverty. My experience has taught me that the biggest barrier to addressing poverty-related disparities is what's called deficit ideology. Deficit ideology. So what is ideology? Ideology is a belief system that often we've developed through ways we have been socialized to see and interpret the world around us. The important thing about ideology is that ideology drives action. So for example, if I have a belief system that, well, if I identify any kind of disparity, let's say students who are experiencing poverty are getting lower test scores than middle-class students. How I interpret that disparity, how I figure out why that disparity exists, impacts the solutions I can imagine. So if I think, well, students who are experiencing poverty get lower test scores because their families do not value education, then my solution is going to be trying to fix or adjust something about those families. And that's based on a misunderstanding. That is an oppressive response to an issue of oppression. The correct interpretation is that people experiencing poverty are up against many, many barriers and challenges and biases and inequities that middle-class people do not deal with. If I understand that as the problem, then what is my solution? My solution is, well, we have to eliminate those barriers. We have to eliminate the biases and the inequities. So it begins with ideology. If I start with the wrong ideology, then I'm always going to end up with an oppressive action. So let me give you one more example from, this is an example from the United States. In the United States, studies show that Black and Latinx students are more likely than white students to be suspended or expelled from school. Again, if I want to fix this problem, the question is, how do I interpret this fact? How do I interpret why this is happening? The most common interpretation is that Black students and Latinx students misbehave more than white students. So the solution is, well, we have to fix the behaviors of Black and Latinx students. We have to adjust their behaviors. So in the United States, many of the solutions are strategies and programs and initiatives that focus on changing something about Black and Latinx students, changing their emotions, changing their culture, changing their mindset. The problem is that research shows that the actual cause of the discipline disparity is not the behavior of Black and Latinx students, but the bias of teachers. So the only possible way to solve this problem is to eliminate the bias. That's the only possible solution. But it's also the least common solution because people misinterpret the problem as a problem in Black students rather than as a problem of racial bias in teachers. So it all goes back to ideology. And, some people don't believe these, facts that I'm sharing. So I always share a few references here. Okay, so what is deficit ideology? People are familiar with a deficit perspective where we focus on students' weaknesses rather than their strengths. Deficit ideology is deeper than that. Deficit ideology is the belief system that the primary cause of disparities exists within people experiencing poverty. Something's wrong with their culture, something's wrong with their mindset. That's deficit ideology. So again, thinking about deficit ideology and equity, this is why deficit ideology is not compatible with equity. As long as deficit ideology exists, equity cannot exist, because deficit ideology hides the actual causes of inequity. So many people will say that the opposite of deficit ideology is a strengths-based view of students. We have to look at students' strengths, but that's not the opposite of deficit ideology. The opposite of deficit ideology is what is called structural ideology. Structural ideology recognizes that disparities are the result of inequitable access and opportunity. So the only way to eliminate a disparity, like students experiencing poverty don't do as well in school, the only way to eliminate that is to eliminate the barriers, the inequities, the biases, and that sort of thing. So deficit ideology is pretty rampant. It's pretty popular in education. And you've probably heard people say things like this. They'll say, those parents don't care about their children's education. That's deficit ideology. Oh, the children in that neighborhood don't have any role models at home. That's deficit ideology. If I don't hold these students accountable, they will never learn responsibility. Anything that is blaming students who are already marginalized or disadvantaged for the outcomes of their disadvantage is deficit ideology. So you might think about statements you've heard that reflect a deficit ideology, statements that you've heard colleagues make where they're blaming people experiencing poverty for the impact of their poverty, for the barriers created by economic injustice. And in fact, in education, a lot of concepts we use suggest a deficit ideology. So a term like achievement gap. This is why people started using the term opportunity gap. And think about how different our conversation is if we talk about the opportunity gap of students experiencing poverty, or if we base our policy on an opportunity gap instead of basing our policy on an achievement gap. Or what if we base our policy on a push-out problem instead of a dropout problem? Think of how different our whole conversation is if instead of talking about students who are dropouts, we talk about students who have been pushed out of school. Or how different our conversation is if instead of talking about people experiencing poverty passing bad habits generation to generation, we talk about communities experiencing poverty who are experiencing inequity and bias generation after generation, and how that impacts them in schools. Okay, so deficit ideology. If I have a deficit ideology, the thing I'm trying to fix with policy are students and families' mindsets, their cultures, their attitudes, their behaviors. But while we do that, what we ignore are the things that should be the focus of equity. We ignore bias, we ignore inequity, we ignore challenges, barriers, discrimination, injustice. There's a second ideology, which is a form of deficit ideology called grit ideology. Grit ideology is the belief system that educational disparities are caused by shortages of resilience and grit within communities experiencing poverty. So with grit ideology, Well, policy is focused on strengthening families' grit, strengthening families' resilience. But the problem again is, while we're focused on the grit and resilience of the families who, by the way, already have the most grit and resilience, what we're still ignoring are the biases and the inequities that exist outside of schools that impact people in school, and the inequities that exist in schools that give wealthier students more access and opportunity than lower income students. So that is really the opposite of equity. That's the opposite of equity. So what we want is what's called a structural ideology or an equity ideology. The belief system that educational disparities are caused by inequitable access and opportunity in school and out of school. So our goal is to learn how to see that inequitable system and all the ways that it privileges some students and disadvantages other students. All of our focus on equity should be on identifying inequity, eliminating inequity, and actively building equity. Our focus on equity should never be about fixing or adjusting the people experiencing inequity, because that is itself an expression of inequity. So we might think about this in terms of questions. If I have a deficit ideology, my question is, what do we need to help adjust about those families, about families experiencing poverty, so they can perform better in school? That's a very oppressive view because it ignores inequity. A grit impulse would be, how do we help those families be more gritty so they can overcome the challenges and barriers? But in an equitable school, we've eliminated those challenges and barriers. So our focus should not be on helping students cope with the oppression they're experiencing. The equity impulse is, what are the barriers and challenges and biases and inequities? How is economic injustice operating? How do we contribute to those things? And how do we eliminate them? And that's what we need to drive the policy question. We need the structural impulse. Policy should be driven by, what are the challenges, the barriers, the inequities, and the biases? How do we eliminate those? So social policy and educational policy, that's what it should focus on. If we're focusing on policy that's about improving conditions, and this is the way we should think about it. It's not policy to help families experiencing poverty do better. It's policies that address the conditions that result in the disparities. So if you think about policies that eliminate, if you think about addressing structural injustice, the conditions outside of schools that contribute to disparities inside schools, we want policies that eliminate disparities in things like access to living wage work. What if every working age adult who had a child in your school had access to one job that paid a living wage? I mean, that would make a huge difference. Access to safe and affordable housing, access to high quality healthcare, including high quality prenatal care. We can start this conversation at who has access to the highest quality prenatal care. Even if you're in a country with socialized medicine, we know that wealthier families can pay to get higher quality care. And that's inequitable. Access to high quality preschool, access to healthy food. These are the conditions that exist outside of school that impact achievement in school, that impact levels of access and opportunity. And if you notice, there's nothing on this list about fixing anything about people experiencing poverty, adjusting anything about the mindsets or the cultures or the values or the behaviors of people experiencing poverty. It's all about fixing the conditions that create and sustain poverty and that ensure that people experiencing poverty have less access and opportunity. We can also think about this institutionally in terms of schools specifically. Access to high quality schooling, access to curriculum that is relevant and relatable, access to educational environments that are free of bias and inequity. And I always say in schools, the first level of accountability is hiring. If I'm in a school that is committed to equity, then I should only hire educators who are committed to equity. And if I'm not hiring educators committed to equity, that means I am not committed to equity. So we have to make sure we're not hiring people to work in schools who have these biases and prejudices or who have a deficit ideology. The next thing we can do is address all disparities. There often are outcome disparities. These are disparities that we measure quantitatively. These are things like differences in test scores, differences in graduation rates, differences in attendance rates. But we also want to make sure that we focus on experience disparities. Because students experiencing poverty often experience bullying in schools, often have teachers who have biases about them, and experience other biases and inequities. And that's not equity, even if they are doing okay academically. If they're experiencing bullying, bias, and discrimination in school, it's still not equity. So we are out of time, but I want to make sure we have time for, I think I'm supposed to stop for some questions here soon. But before I do that, I wanted to ask you a couple of questions. The first question is, and this is, I use a framework that we call equity literacy. Equity literacy is about how do we strengthen our literacy around equity so that equity becomes a lens, and everything we do, we filter it through this lens of equity. And in order to develop this equity literacy, part of what we need to be able to do is practice learning how to recognize subtle forms of inequity so that we can create policy that addresses the actual problem. So I might ask a question like this. What is an example of a policy, or that should say policy or practice? What is an example of a policy or practice you have seen, observed in education that could possibly humiliate or embarrass students or families who are experiencing poverty? What is an example of something like that? And, you know, in order to create more equity, I have to learn how to recognize things like this. It's not that policies and practices are designed in order to humiliate students experiencing poverty. But what are policies or practices that are created because people don't realize that they could end up humiliating students or families experiencing poverty?
Thank you very much. Yes, many things you've said coincided with something that Paul said, I think. And he said, we should not employ teachers in schools who have stereotypes or who believe. But our problem is that we already have these teachers in schools. So I'm just wondering, how do we break that barrier? Because it's not like we can, you know, just dismiss all teachers. And obviously it's something to do with how do we educate them before they enter classroom, but it's also how we, you know, work with teachers during their careers. And we know that in the region, we've had lots and lots and lots of social justice trainings for teachers.
Yeah.
And some moves have been made, but maybe as a comment, what do you think about that?
You know, it is very difficult. I mean, you know, just getting rid of a lot of teachers because they have biases and if they've been there for a long time. But I think this can be done with good leadership. If good school leadership is very committed to equity and justice, then, you know, if they're committed and they're moving the school forward toward that, and they say, this is not optional, this is the expectation I have of everybody, and everybody's work will be evaluated partially based on their commitment to this, then in a way, there's a way that I don't know how to say this differently, so I'll just say it the way I want to say it, which is, in a way, if leadership is doing a good job with equity, then the people who don't want to commit to equity, who work in the school, should feel like they are marginalized in the school. They should feel like I don't want to work here. This is not a place I want to work. But too often, the people who speak up the loudest about equity and justice are the ones who feel like, you know, they're burning out and, you know, they don't want to stay in a school where other people are not committed. So you just say, you know, this is my expectation. And if you can't get on board for this, you know, maybe it's better if you work somewhere else. Maybe it's better if you don't work in education at all.
That would be the best, probably, yeah. Okay, thank you, Paul, so much. I think it was really an inspirational thing. And this breaking of the barriers is actually, I would say, our main job.